So, as you'll gather, both Simon and actually John have set up my talk very nicely. I mean, John talked about introductions and the spread, and then Simon, of course, homed in on squalidus. I'm going to sort of continue these points. Plant mingling and evolution in urban environments. Over the last few hundred years, many plant species which formerly never came into contact with each other have come together, grown together as a result of human activities due to their joint introductions, etc. And this coming together has been brought about by increases in trade, travel, and basically the introduction of species from distant parts. Now, by growing together, and they are often in urban environments, we see aliens growing together in sites like this. This is a demolition site that I photographed way back in the 1970s in Cardiff. These introduced species may rapidly adapt to the conditions they find in their new environments, something which Jonathan Silvertown mentioned in his sort of Zoom introduction first thing this morning. In addition, they may hybridise with each other. And that hybridisation can lead to gene exchange between species, and on occasion, the origin of new species, new hybrid species. And it is this that I'm going to focus on in my talk now. So there's been an upsurge of interest in plant evolution in urban environments, plant speciation in urban environments, as demonstrated by these recent reviews. In particular, and of great relevance to the talk I'm going to give, is a review by the late Don Levin, came out in 2019, which focused on plant speciation in the age of climate change. But this applies to plant speciation in urban environments as well. So what Levin did was to predict the time to formation of species in urban environments, or in his case, as a result of climate change. And he pointed out that most species in the next 500 years will probably originate by polyploidy. This is because polyploidy is a very rapid process. If you look at the y-axis there, the indication is that you will get a new polyploid species originating over a period of about 100 years. In fact, you can get it forming in just a couple of generations. On the other hand, the usual way in which species form by lineage splitting, adapting to different environments maybe, is a much lengthier process and can take up to 1 million to 10 million years. There are examples, of course, where new species have originated by lineage splitting much faster than that, but these are sort of the averages. In between, we have speciation occurring by hybrid speciation not involving polyploidy, and also by chromosomal rearrangement. So, if we look at Levin's predictions, we would think that most species are going to originate by polyploidy in the next 500 years, very few by lineage splitting, and a few, such as the Oxford Ragwort, by hybrid speciation without polyploidy or by chromosomal rearrangement. Now, in fact, just over 30 years ago, I did write a review which emphasised the fact that plant invasions can lead to interspecific hybridization and the evolution of new plant taxa. And this theme was taken up by Chris Thomas at York University, and he has established a sort of group there now looking at Anthropocene speciation, or speciation in the Anthropocene. And according to Chris, the Anthropocene will be a period of rapid acceleration of plant speciation. And he also goes further that speciation by hybridization is likely to be a signature of the Anthropocene. So we'll probably come back to that at the end of my talk. Now, when you look at the distribution of aliens, I mean, John mentioned this across Scotland and linked it with the number of humans who live in a particular area. Well, this is a map that was done for the whole of Europe and was based on sort of detailed surveys of the British Isles, Catalonia, and also in the Czech Republic. And by extension, they sort of drew up a map for the whole of Europe. And what you see is the green bits are where levels of aliens fall below 1%, and the red bits are where aliens are above 5%. And you can link these with sort of the high areas, the areas of high alien presence is linked with areas of industrialization, urbanization, and high levels of high numbers of humans in the local population. So more specifically for the British Isles, there was this wonderful book that was published in 2015, I think, written by Clive Stace, Chris Preston, who's with us today, and David Pearman, called The Hybrid Flora of the British Isles. And it's an absolute mine of information. And in that, first of all, it points out that approximately 50% of the species in all species, the total number of species in Britain and Ireland, 2,711 according to their numbers, approximately 50% of that is made up of introduced species. And for the first time, well, not for the first time, but the most recent estimate of spontaneous hybrid combinations between these different between these species had risen to 909. And specifically for hybrids, they there's a map here. There's many maps of hybrids distributions throughout this flora, but this is a sort of composite one, and it shows you that most hybrids are found in urban and industrial areas. So when do hybrids form? Well, obviously the two parent species have to grow together, and clearly in urban areas this is promoted in areas of disturbance, but that's not the whole story. And Max Brown with Alex Twyford and co-workers published a paper earlier this year in PNAS where they said that the best prediction of hybrid formation in the British flora, they focused on the British flora, were genetic factors, specifically the amount of genetic distance between the two parents of a hybrid and their ploidy. If they are of a different ploidy, you're less likely to get a hybrid forming between them than if they are of the same ploidy. Although, as we will see, you do get hybrids forming between species with having different ploidy levels. Other factors obviously come into being. I already mentioned range overlap, genocide, life history, mating system. They all have an effect, but they were found to be less important than genetic distance and ploidy when you're considering about which species will hybridize. So here I follow on from what Simon was talking about, the spread of the Oxford Ragwort in Britain. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the evolutionary consequences that followed from the hybridization of the Oxford Ragwort with a native British species. So just to recap, here's a group of maps which show you how the Senecio squalidus originated from 1820 more or less up to the present time. And as you can see, it's very much like those maps which John showed you about a spread up from this part of England going up through into Scotland and into Ireland as well. And on these sorts of sites, these sort of highly disturbed sites in urban areas, the Oxford Ragwort comes into contact with one of our native species, the common groundsel, Senecio vulgaris. And whereas, as Simon pointed out, the Oxford Ragwort is self-incompatible, producing these sort of showy flower heads, capitula, the native groundsel is self-compatible and produces these very inconspicuous flower heads, which normally have no ray florets, which are very prominent in the Oxford Ragwort. Now, when these two species, and note that they differ in their ploidy level, so common groundsel is a tetraploid, Oxford Ragwort is a diploid. When those two species cross, they produce a triploid hybrid, and that is highly sterile because it produces gametes which has too many or too few chromosomes, making these gametes inviable. However, it so happens that even though that sterile hybrid is, even though that hybrid, that triploid hybrid is sterile, a number of hybrid products, species and variants of species have risen as a result of those two species crossing. One of these is the Welsh groundsel, which was first recorded in 1948, so this is a recent origin. And you notice that that has 60 chromosomes in contrast to the two parent species. Another one is the York groundsel, which is tetraploid. It's only found in York, and that was recorded as recently as 1879. And finally, there is a variant form of the common groundsel, which we call radiate groundsel. It's tetraploid. It's very similar to the common groundsel, but it has ray florets. I mentioned earlier that normally groundsel doesn't have those ray florets. And that was recorded or first noted in Britain at a much earlier date in 1832. Okay, so I'm going to say something about each of these in terms of how they originated and their establishment, etc., in Britain since their origin. So first of all, the Welsh groundsel. So here's the two species, we've just seen them, that they cross to produce that sterile F1, and simply by chromosome doubling, polyploidy, you get a fertile allopolyploid. So it's a two-step process. First of all, they hybridize, then the hybrid doubles its chromosomes, and you get, hey presto, a new species, a fertile allohexaploid. And this was demonstrated, first of all, it's documented in Rossa, but also it was also recreated by Weir and Ingram by simply making the cross, producing the sterile F1 and treating the F1 with colchicine, which has the effect of doubling the chromosome complement and producing a synthetic form of the Welsh Ragwort, which groundsel, which was fertile. Note that this new allopolyploid species produces sterile hybrids with both of its parents, so it's very much a new species in that it is reproductively isolated from both parents. Interestingly, there have been two separate origins of the Welsh groundsel. First of all, in North Wales, and secondly, in Edinburgh. The one in North Wales was recorded first record of it was in 1945, and in Edinburgh, I first sort of discovered that in 1982, but subsequently looking through herbarium records in the Edinburgh Botanic Garden Herbarium, we discovered someone had actually collected it in 1974, but misnamed it as radiate groundsel rather than the Welsh groundsel.
Sorry, who was that person?
It was a woman. I can't remember her name.
Was it Effie Rosser?
Who?
Effie Rosser.
No, she was the one who discovered it in North Wales. But the one...
She worked in Edinburgh.
Yeah, well it could be, but I'm not sure. I'll have to go back.
Yeah.
I don't think it was, but you could be right. Okay. So moving on to the York groundsel. First discovered in 1979 in a car park. This only grows in York, and it's found growing along the banks of the River Ouse mainly, but also in nearby waste sites and car parks at the time. Now, this also is a product of the two species crossing, producing the sterile hybrid. But this time, what's happened is that the sterile F1 hybrid does produce some fertile gametes occasionally, and this enables some back crosses to form with groundsel. And we believe that as a result of that introgression, York groundsel originated. And although this needs to be substantiated, we believe that a fairly large chunk of Oxford Ragwort genome was transferred into the groundsel, common groundsel, to produce this York variant, this York groundsel. In terms of it being reproductively isolated, there's a chromosome barrier between it and the Oxford Ragwort parent, so it's reproductively isolated from that. It is actually fertile with the common groundsel. When you cross these two, you produce fertile hybrids, so they're not reproductively isolated as such, but they tend to don't grow together, or didn't grow together, and also there is a slight difference in their flowering times. So there's a sort of a prezygotic barrier there rather than a postzygotic reproductive isolating barrier. This is just gives you, for those who are not familiar with introgression, this is what happens in introgression. You get a cross between two parent species, A and B, A red, B blue, and then you get this F1 back crosses to species A, and it can go on for a number of back cross generations, and in each generation the proportion of the species B genome in the back cross product is halved. So if you allow this back crossing procedure to go on for a long period of time, you end up with species A, which contains just a few genes of species B. This is just the results of a morphometric analysis of the two parent species, the Welsh groundsels, the North Wales lineage, the Edinburgh lineage, and the York groundsel. And you can see that they're all distinct from each other, but the hybrid products, as you would expect, are sort of placed in an intermediate position between groundsel and Oxford Ragwort, at least along this axis here, which accounts for 72% of the variation. Okay, so then we move on to radiate groundsel, which, just to remind you, was first recorded in 1832 and is widespread in the UK. So it's complete contrast with the Welsh groundsel and the York groundsel. So this is a distribution of radiate groundsel. These are all the records that have been collected from the 1930s through to this is the most recent map of 2023. And you see that it's fairly widespread, with a predominance in the sort of northwest of England, also at that time South Wales, and across the central belt of Scotland. So the origin of this, once again, is as a result of the crossing between those two parent species, production of a sterile F1, which then back-crossed the common groundsel, so that by a process of introgression again, radiate groundsel was formed, but on this occasion only a small bit of the Oxford Ragwort genome was transferred into groundsel. Radiate groundsel is reproductively isolated from Oxford Ragwort, but of course not with the common groundsel. These are both members of the same species, and they interbreed and they form heterozygous plants which have short ray florets. But because both predominantly self, you don't get too many of these heterozygotes produced in a population where both parents are present. So radiate groundsel, this is the distribution, that's what they look like when they're close up. And the absence of ray florets on their flower heads is controlled by a single gene. So that when you make a cross between these two, you get that heterozygote I just mentioned. If you self that, these three types segregate out in a 1-to-1 ratio, sort of Mendelian ratio. Now, putting ray florets, this is just an aside, putting ray florets on a groundsel flower head has quite a significant effect on pollinator visit frequency. So when both are present in stands that were we set up in a 50-50 ratio of non-radiate and radiate, we found that the pollinators mainly went to the radiate plants. 72% of pollinative visits were to those with the ray florets, only 28% to those types. This has an effect on the breeding system or mating system, so that outcrossing is boosted in the radiate variant. It can rise up to 36%, whereas normally it's around about 1 or 2% in this non-radiate type, but very occasionally it can get higher. Okay, so I've mentioned how these three different hybrid taxa are all produced from crossing between the Oxford Ragwort and the native groundsel, how they originated. Now I want to go on and just consider briefly the likelihood of their formation, or the formation of hybrid species or varieties. So this shows you the distribution of the Oxford Ragwort. As you can see, it's very widespread throughout Britain and gets into Ireland. And this is the distribution of the Oxford Ragwort. You see there's much overlap between these two. Their ranges overlap, plenty of opportunity therefore for producing the F1 hybrid. However, production of the F1 hybrid appears to be a rare event. This map shows you all the records of finding the F1 hybrid in Britain since the 1930s, or pre-1930s. There's one which was found before 1930, and these are more recent records. So, although you can make crosses between the two species and very occasionally produce the F1 hybrid in the glasshouse, in the wild it seems to occur very, very rarely. So that's the first step, F1 hybrid formation. But if you're going to get a hybrid species or a variety of a species formed, it's likely that that hybridization has to go beyond the first step of F1 hybrid formation. You need, in some cases, to have a hybrid swarm forming. So we went through the herbarium records to see whether we could locate historical hybrid swarms, and we actually found about 20 places where they turned up. And here's a few of them. First of all, that one at Cork, then in the Bristol, Cardiff area, down in Southampton area, King's Lynn, and then up in Scotland, both in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Well, I've spent a lot of time looking for hybrid swarms. I've only ever found them in Cork and in Edinburgh. None of those exist today. So they come and they go, and they are rare. So the likelihood of hybrid species of variety formation, based on what we know of the F1 formation and the formation of hybrid zones, is quite slim. Now, what about establishment? After formation, a species has to become established if it's going to make a contribution to the biodiversity, the local flora. Well, this is what's happened in North Wales since we first started making counts of individuals of the Welsh Ragwort back in 1982, I think the first records were made. And as you can see, in 1984, it actually peaked above 4,000. And this is a number of plants stretched over about 35 different sites at the time. Sadly, the species has gone into decline, and we can see that the most recent records, which was taken by Lucy Boyer, was about 100 spread over about 5 or 6 sites. So it's on the way would look to be on the way to extinction. Well, it's already gone extinct in Edinburgh. It was only there for about 20 years, first recorded in 1974. By 1994 it was extinct. The maximum number of individuals ever found in Edinburgh was just over 100. And we had this sort of steady decline over this period of time. Those familiar with Leith will possibly recognise these sites from, must have been the 1980s, I guess, when Leith was undergoing quite a lot of rebuilding, renovations and so on. And we found, and there were lots of the two parent species, Oxford Ragwort and groundsel, growing around. And the Welsh Ragwort, Senecio cambrensis, used to grow along the water of Leith. And here you can see one of the plants that grew there. With York groundsel, that only lasts lasted a very short period of time. It was first discovered in 1979, and 20 years later, it couldn't be found again. So it has become extinct in the wild by 2000. So it had a very sort of short shelf life. Finally, radiate groundsel, finally in terms of establishment. Now, I showed you a map of the distribution of radiate groundsel, and it seemed to be spread widely over England and lots of places in Wales, going north into Ireland. But this is the latest map, based in 2023 on the most recent records since 2000, the period 2000 to 2019. And as you can see, the range, the distribution of this variant has also contracted quite markedly. So it's now mainly found in the northwest England and also in North Wales, and you still get it across the central belt of Scotland. So why have all three hybrid taxa suffered a decline in their numbers and distribution over the last 25 years or so? Well, there could be a number of causes. One, reduction of suitable sites to colonise. It may be the case that there were many more of the sites present in urban areas that could be colonised by these plants, these new hybrids, than there are today. And certainly that's my sort of personal opinion. You know, certainly in Edinburgh, for example, during the 1970s and 80s, whole areas were being laid waste by a massive rebuilding and redevelopment programme. And you used to be able to go to these sites and find thousands, if not millions, of Oxford Ragwort and groundsel plants growing together. You go around Edinburgh today, even in sort of the industrial areas, and the number of these disturbed sites have sort of vanished, or vanished to a very low number. When these new species are born, as you might say, soon after origin, they have very small populations and therefore are subject to random changes in population size. They suffer from demographic stochasticity much more so than their parents, so this is another factor. There's been increased herbicide use against weed populations. I haven't got any data on that, but that's my sort of personal observation. So these small populations can quickly get wiped out by, herbicide. A fourth possibility is I don't think any of these three taxa occupy a novel habitat. They tend to be colonists of open, disturbed land and therefore occupy the same type of habitats, disturbed urban habitats that their parents do. So they will be subject to competition from their parents, and they might easily therefore get squeezed out of these sites for one reason or another. Niche divergence, which is what this is about, they don't occupy a novel niche compared to their parents. Niche divergence, it has been shown to be very important in the success of hybrid species. So here's a recent paper by Wang et al., which looked at abiotic niche divergence of hybrid species from their progenitors. And in this, they compared the realised niches, that's where the species actually grow, of 60 allopolyploid and 20 homoploid hybrid species, comparing them with their parents. And it turns out that both allopolyploid hybrid species, that's AHS, and homoploid hybrid species the ones which have been successful or well established in nature tend to occupy a novel niche compared with their parents, or an intermediate niche. So most hybrid species occupy a novel or intermediate niche. Other examples of recent allopolyploid speciation. 2 minutes, okay, we'll skip this. There are other examples, but they are very limited. Okay, I want to say quickly something about conservation. Are these sort of transient hybrid species of importance? Well, certainly, from a scientific point of view, they've been very important. The study of these new hybrid taxa has greatly improved our understanding of the processes involved in the origin of allopolyploid, homoploid hybrid species and these intraspecific variants. So seeds should be stored in seed banks for further analysis so that this can be continued into the future. But should they be conserved in the wild? Well, possibly we may have a different, or, people have different views about this. What I want to do is just very quickly show you a clip from a recent sort of BBC News, which indicates that at least it's of interest to look at, to conserve these hybrids. And this concerns the York groundsel. So this is a programme, a clip from Look North, the news programme, goes out in sort of Yorkshire, and it went out in April this year, or May this year.
Thank you. Now, when you think of bringing something back from extinction, Jurassic Park and the dinosaurs probably spring to mind. But how about a tiny yellow flower? This pretty little bloom is called the York groundsel. Scientists have brought it back to life after it disappeared for more than 20 years. And if you look carefully, you can find it flowering once again. Kathy Killick has been to track it down.
You wouldn't give it a second glance, but blooming along York's riverbanks is a botanical miracle. This tiny yellow flower has been brought back from the dead after 20 years of extinction. Time for a little botany lesson, folks. This is common groundsel and this is Oxford Ragwort. Now, sometime in the 1970s, these two plants hybridised to produce a new species, York groundsel. Now, it's quite unusual for that to happen in the wild, so York scientists kept an eye on it and they even banked some seed, which was lucky because in the 1990s, this little plant died out. The seed, though, survived in the Millennium Seed Bank, a repository of 2.4 billion seeds frozen deep underground in Sussex. Last year, fearing the seed would no longer be viable, it was planted in a polytunnel in Wales by the Rare British Plants Nursery.
Because we grew these plants in a greenhouse environment with plenty of fertilizer, they grew into very large, substantial plants like this, rather than the tiny little individuals that would grow on the pavements in York.
60,000 seeds gathered painstakingly in the polytunnel were sown in York in February, and now the seedlings are being counted, monitored and recorded by Alex Prendergast for Natural England. He reckons about 1,000 plants have now germinated in the city.
Drought certainly impacted quite a lot of the seedlings, so we've lost quite a few seedlings, but I'm pleased to see several dozen plants in flower today, so hopefully they'll set seed and that seed can spread around York.
It's a provocative question, but it's a tiny, insignificant little yellow thing. Why should we care? Why all the fuss?
Well, it's a species that we've got international responsibility for. It only lives in York and it's only ever lived in York. Also, it's quite a cheery, sunny-looking thing which brightens up the pavements and might well be important for pollinators in the future. It's quite a showy little plant and it flowers in every month of the year, so it might be quite good for the bees and the flies.
It's such an unusual set of circumstances, it puts York groundsel in a unique class of its own. A globally extinct British plant brought back into existence, where it should, hopefully, grace York's riverbanks for years to come. Cathy Killick, BBC Look North.
Okay, I'll finish off there. Well, let me just say one thing. You remember I showed this slide right at the beginning, and here's Chris Thomas saying rapid acceleration of plant speciation during the Anthropocene, and also speciation by hybridisation is likely to be a signature of Anthropocene. From my own experience, it is the case there are going to be some successes, the Oxford Ragwort being one of them, but many are going to be very transient and they won't possibly have much of a contribution to urban biodiversity.